Today, we're going to slip quietly into the shadows of the medieval world, not as kings or knights, but as someone far less fortunate, a thief. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine a narrow cobblestone street lit only by moonlight, the smell of smoke in the air, the distant echo of church bells. There are no streetlights, no second chances, and no mercy courts waiting to hear your side of the story. One stolen loaf of bread could cost you a hand or your life. But here's the question that pulls us in tonight. Was it really about crime or survival? In a world balanced on the edge of famine and fear, where a single missing sheep could doom a family through winter, what did it truly mean to steal? And why were the punishments so brutally public? As we gently unravel this forgotten side of history, you'll discover that being a medieval thief wasn't daring or romantic. It was cold, exhausting, and terrifying. So settle in. Let the noise of the modern world fade away, and together we'll wander through torch, lit streets and silent forests, uncovering the harsh reality hidden behind the legend. To be a medieval thief was not to live as a clever rogue slipping through shadows with a wink and a grin, but to exist in a world where hunger, fear, and brutality pressed in from every direction, where even a stolen loaf of bread could spiral into mutilation, exile, or death, and where the romantic image we inherit from stories of figures like Robin Hood bears almost no resemblance to the harsh reality faced by desperate men, women, and even children who turn to theft in places such as London, Paris, Florence, or small unnamed villages scattered across Europe. In the medieval world, survival itself was fragile. Harvests failed, winters were long and cruel, and social mobility was nearly non-existent. So most thieves were not master criminals plotting elaborate heists, but impoverished labourers, runaway serfs, widows, or abandoned youths trying to survive in rigid feudal systems that offered little mercy. Laws were harsh not because societies were orderly, but because authority was anxious. Rulers and local lords feared instability, rebellion, and divine judgment. So punishment became a spectacle designed to terrify rather than rehabilitate. If caught stealing livestock in rural England, under systems influenced by institutions like the Kingdom of England, a person might face hanging even if the theft was born of starvation, because animals represented wealth, survival, and status, and to steal them threatened the economic foundation of a manor. In crowded cities under the authority of entities, such as the Kingdom of France, petty theft could result in branding, ear cropping, or time in fetid prisons where disease spread faster than justice. There were no public defenders, no concept of nuanced criminal psychology, and little distinction between minor and major crimes. In practice, courts were inconsistent, often corrupt, and deeply influenced by class. A noble accused of theft might pay a fine, but a peasant would bleed for it. Daily life for a medieval thief meant constant paranoia. Towns were small, and everyone knew each other. Suspicion alone could destroy a reputation. Without identification systems, communities relied on memory and rumour. If someone was branded or mutilated, the mark ensured they would be recognised everywhere they went. Branding letters onto the skin, or cutting off fingers, was not only punishment, but a permanent social sentence. Once marked, legitimate work became nearly impossible to find, pushing the punished person back toward crime in a vicious cycle. Travel was dangerous too. Forests were not romantic hideouts, but harsh wilderness areas filled with bandits who would rob fellow criminals without hesitation. Roads were controlled by toll collectors and patrolled irregularly, and strangers drew attention immediately. Unlike the cinematic world of swashbuckling adventure we see in films about figures like Robin Hood, real thieves did not gather merry bands living comfortably in Greenwood freedom. They hid in filth, survived on scraps, and trusted no one completely. Urban theft brought its own misery. Medieval cities were cramped, unsanitary, and crowded, but also intensely communal. A pickpocket caught in a marketplace could be beaten by a mob before any official arrived. Public punishment was entertainment. Executions were staged in central squares so that crowds could watch, shout, and absorb the lesson. This is what happens when you cross authority. Hanging was common, but sometimes death was slow and humiliating. Stocks and pillories locked offenders in place for hours or days, allowing passers-by to throw refuse, stones, or worse. The smell of rot, sewage, and human waste filled the air. Disease was omnipresent. A wounded thief risked infection that could kill more painfully than the law itself. Medical knowledge was limited, and superstition ran deep. So criminals were often seen not just as lawbreakers, but as morally corrupt or spiritually tainted. In deeply religious societies shaped by institutions like the Catholic Church, theft was not merely a social offense, but a sin endangering the soul. Confession and repentance might promise divine forgiveness, but earthly punishment rarely softened. The legal systems themselves were unpredictable. Trial by ordeal, though declining by the later Middle Ages, still lingered in cultural memory. Holding hot iron, plunging a hand into boiling water, or being bound and thrown into water to see whether one floated, were all practices reflecting a belief that God would reveal innocence. Even when ordeals faded, torture became a tool of interrogation in many regions. A suspected thief might confess to crimes never committed simply to end the pain. There was no presumption of innocence in the modern sense. Reputation mattered immensely. If you were already poor or socially marginal, suspicion stuck easily. Guild systems in cities guarded economic opportunity tightly. If you were not a member, you were already at the edge of survival. Stealing from a guild member risked not only legal reprisal but collective retaliation from an organized, economically powerful group. Economic desperation fueled theft, but it also magnified consequences. Grain theft during famine could be treated almost as rebellion because it threatened communal stability. During periods of upheaval, such as the social tensions leading to events like the Peasants' Revolt, authorities became even more paranoid about disorder, and petty criminals were treated as symbols of chaos that needed crushing. Punishments were intentionally disproportionate to deter others. Moreover, prisons were not long. Term correctional facilities, as in modern systems, they were temporary holding places before trial or execution, and conditions were horrific. Overcrowded cells, lack of sanitation, minimal food, and abuse from guards made imprisonment itself a slow torment. Families of the accused suffered too. If a father was executed or mutilated, his children might lose economic support entirely, pushing them toward beggary or crime and perpetuating cycles of poverty. For women, the situation could be even more precarious. A woman accused of theft risked sexual exploitation during detention, public shaming that destroyed marriage prospects, or accusations of broader moral corruption. Gender norms were rigid, and stepping outside them invited suspicion. Children were not spared either. Young pickpockets could be whipped or imprisoned alongside adults. There was little concept of juvenile justice. Survival often meant attaching oneself to dangerous networks, bands of criminals who offered protection but demanded loyalty and silence. Betrayal was common because survival incentives were brutal. Informing on others might reduce one's sentence. Trust eroded quickly in such environments. The physical environment compounded the hardship. Medieval homes lacked secure locks by modern standards, but communities compensated through vigilance. Night watchmen patrolled streets, and curfews were common. After dark, movement without explanation could invite arrest. Lighting was minimal, so operating in darkness risked falling into open drains or being mistaken for a more serious criminal. Weapons were widespread. A householder might respond to intrusion with lethal force. There were no emergency services to ensure a thief's safety if injured. Even successful theft provided uncertain reward. Stolen goods had to be fenced discreetly, and fences themselves could betray clients to authorities. Coins were scarce in rural areas, and barter systems limited the usefulness of stolen items. Livestock theft required transporting animals that could not be easily hidden. Social stigma was enduring. Medieval society revolved around honor, oath, and reputation. Once labeled a thief, reintegration was nearly impossible. Unlike modern narratives of redemption, communities were tight-knit and memory-long. Parish records, local gossip, and visible punishments preserved identity. A branded forehead or missing ear was a living record. Marriage prospects vanished. Apprenticeships were denied. Even if one escaped to another town, dialect differences, clothing styles, and unfamiliarity with local customs could expose an outsider quickly. Mobility existed, but was risky and expensive. Serfs, in particular, were legally bound to land, fleeing to commit theft elsewhere, risked being hunted down by a lord's agents. Violence was omnipresent. Not only did authorities employ it, but victims did too. Self-defense was immediate and often lethal. A thief breaking into a cottage might be attacked by the household, neighbors, or passing guards. Community justice could be swift and merciless. Lynching without formal trial occurred, especially in smaller settlements where legal infrastructure was thin. Fear governed interactions. The thief feared capture. The community feared scarcity and disorder. Authorities feared loss of control. In such a climate, mercy was rare because survival felt collective and precarious. Even psychologically, the toll was immense. Living constantly on edge, sleeping in unstable conditions, unsure of the next meal, always scanning for betrayal or pursuit, eroded mental resilience. Medieval spirituality framed suffering in cosmic terms. A thief might internalize the belief that hardship was divine punishment, compounding guilt and despair. There were no support systems, no rehabilitation programs. no advocacy groups arguing for proportional sentencing. Justice was intertwined with theology and power. To steal was to violate not only property, but perceived divine order. And yet, theft persisted because inequality and scarcity persisted. That paradox reveals why it truly sucked to be a medieval thief. Not because thieves were uniquely villainous, but because the system into which they were born left so few alternatives, and then punished their attempts at survival with extraordinary cruelty. It also meant existing in a legal culture where suffering was considered instructive. Pain was not merely a consequence, it was believed to be corrective, purifying and socially stabilizing. That belief justified extremes. If you were caught stealing, your punishment was not tailored to your circumstances, but to the community's need for reassurance. The spectacle mattered more than your story. Hunger, debt, desperation. These were explanations, not excuses. The system was not designed to ask why you stole. It was designed to ensure others did not. Medieval communities were tightly interdependent. Wells were shared. Ovens were communal. Fields were worked in coordinated strips. Theft disrupted not just property but cooperation. If trust fractured, daily life became harder for everyone. That is why reaction could be so severe. But from the thief's perspective, this meant that every act widened isolation. The more you stole, the less you belonged. And the less you belonged, the fewer legal ways you had to survive. Even charity could humiliate. Almsgiving often required public acknowledgement of need. To accept charity was to declare poverty openly. Some may have chosen theft partly to avoid the shame of begging, yet theft carried far greater shame if discovered. It was a cruel double bind: reveal your desperation and endure stigma, or conceal it and risk annihilation. The structure of medieval time added another layer of difficulty. Life revolved around daylight. Night was dark in a literal sense. No streetlights. Minimal artificial illumination. That might seem helpful for a thief, but it was also disorienting and dangerous. Navigating uneven streets in darkness risked injury. Torches drew attention. Moonlight was unpredictable. Weather could obscure visibility. Night theft was not sleek and silent. It was clumsy, uncertain, and fraught with sensory risk. The material culture of the period also limited gains. Most households owned few surplus goods. Furniture was sparse, clothing was valuable, but often worn thin. Tools were practical and personalized. Stealing from the poor yielded little profit. Stealing from the wealthy invited enormous danger. The margin between risk and reward was skewed against the thief almost every time. Authority figures were not abstract bureaucrats. They were known individuals, sheriffs, bailiffs, reeves, who often lived among the people they governed. Crossing them meant facing someone who might already hold personal opinions about you. Enforcement could become personal. A bailiff embarrassed by repeated theft in his jurisdiction might pursue offenders aggressively to restore his own standing. There was also the issue of confession under community pressure. In small settlements, elders and clergy might intervene to urge admission of guilt for the sake of restoring harmony. Refusal could be framed as stubbornness or further dishonesty. Admission might bring spiritual reconciliation but harsher legal certainty. Silence might preserve legal ambiguity, but increased social suspicion. Every choice carried cost. If you were imprisoned, you relied on others for sustenance. Jails did not consistently feed inmates. Family members or friends had to bring food. If your family was poor or ashamed, they might struggle to support you. Hunger could become acute, even before sentencing. Survival inside confinement depended on external loyalty, which theft had already strained. Even execution did not always end suffering swiftly. Methods could malfunction. A poorly calculated drop during hanging led to slow strangulation. Crowds might jeer. The condemned might be denied dignity in final moments. Families witnessing such scenes carried trauma long afterward. For the thief contemplating risk, these images were not distant myths, but recent memories. In regions where restitution was possible, inability to pay could convert into extended punishment. If you stole goods worth more than you could repay, the imbalance might justify harsher sentencing. Wealthier offenders could sometimes negotiate fines. Poor ones could not. Justice tilted toward those with resources. Travel by sea or river might seem like escape, but ports were controlled environments. Ships required crews with reputations. Captains valued trust. A known thief would struggle to secure passage. Smuggling oneself aboard risked further criminal charges. Coastal towns were vigilant because trade was lifeblood. Theft there threatened economic survival. There was also the corrosive effect of constant fear on moral compass. Repeated risk and secrecy could desensitize someone to wrongdoing. Small thefts might escalate. Escalation increased stakes. Higher stakes increased likelihood of violence. Violence increased severity of punishment. The spiral was steep and unforgiving. The absence of standardized documentation sometimes meant punishment varied wildly. But it also meant protection varied wildly. You could not rely on precedent. What happened to another thief last month did not guarantee similar treatment for you. Outcomes depended on mood, context, and politics. That unpredictability was itself a source of anxiety. Aging thieves faced another harsh truth. There was no pension for outlaws. Physical decline meant reduced agility and strength. Chronic injuries from beatings or escapes compounded weakness. Without stable trade or property, old age brought vulnerability. Communities rarely supported those who had violated trust repeatedly. Isolation deepened with time. Even in rare cases where thieves formed organized bands, survival was precarious. Bands attracted attention. Authorities responded with patrols or collective punishment. Villages might refuse entry to suspicious groups. Sustaining a network required supplies, secrecy, and discipline, hard to maintain under pressure. In essence, it sucked to be a medieval thief, because the world offered no soft landings. Every pathway was edged with danger. Poverty pushed you forward, law pushed you back. Community memory closed doors. Religion magnified guilt. Punishment scarred body and name. There was no reset button, no anonymous restart, no structured rehabilitation. To live that life was to move constantly between hunger and fear, between secrecy and exposure, between fleeting gain and lasting consequence. The medieval system was built to preserve order in a precarious world. And those who threatened that order, even in desperation, absorbed the full force of its response. The result was not adventure or legend for most, but exhaustion, injury, disgrace, and often an end that was as public as it was final. It also meant living in a society where opportunity was structurally scarce and forgiveness structurally weaker still. Medieval economies did not produce constant growth or abundant surplus. Most years hovered near subsistence. When harvests were good, relief was temporary when they failed. Desperation spread quickly. In such an environment, theft was not just illegal, it was destabilizing. A missing sack of grain might mean the difference between survival and famine for a household. That fragility intensified communal anger. So even if you stole out of necessity, you were perceived as threatening collective endurance. The legal idea of proportionality was not consistently applied the way modern systems attempt to apply it. Theft could be categorized as a felony in many places, especially if it involved certain goods like livestock or tools essential for agriculture. Livestock theft was particularly dangerous because animals were economic engines. Ploughing, breeding, milk production, taking one animal could cripple a farm. Punishment, therefore, aimed to match what authorities perceived as the scale of harm, which often meant execution. There was also the issue of status-based credibility. Medieval courts often relied on compurgation, bringing forward people who would swear to your good character. But if you were known as dishonest, finding enough reputable individuals willing to risk their own standing to defend you was nearly impossible. Your social isolation became legal vulnerability. Without supporters, your case weakened drastically. The spatial design of medieval settlements worked against repeat offenders. People noticed patterns. If goods disappeared repeatedly in one area, suspicion narrowed to familiar faces. Outsiders might be blamed first, but locals with prior reputations were never far behind. The smaller the village, the harder anonymity became. In many cases, simply being present in the wrong place at the wrong time could invite questioning. The concept of restitution sometimes required thieves to repay victims multiple times the value of stolen goods. For someone already impoverished, this was unmanageable. Failure to repay could escalate punishment. Thus, a single act might entangle you in debt and legal penalties that extended far beyond the original offence. There was also the practical difficulty of hiding stolen goods. Most homes lacked secret compartments. Floors were earthen or simple planks. Walls were thin. Storage was visible. If authorities searched a house, and they sometimes did, they were likely to find concealed items. There were no complex concealment technologies. Secrecy relied on physical improvisation, which was often crude. In addition, medieval communities placed enormous emphasis on honor and oath-taking. Breaking trust in one domain bled into others. A known thief might be excluded from participating in communal decisions, barred from serving in local roles, or denied access to certain shared resources. Social marginalization tightened gradually but relentlessly. Even punishment short of death could result in long-term incapacitation. Whipping left scars that could reopen under strain. Amputation reduced work capacity dramatically in labor. Intensive societies. Branding not only marked the body but invited harassment. It also meant existing in a society where time did not dilute punishment but amplified it. Medieval justice was not simply about stopping the individual. It was about imprinting a lesson onto the collective mind. When someone was punished for theft, the memory of that punishment lingered in communal storytelling for years. People would reference it in warnings to children, in tavern conversations, in sermons. The thief's name became shorthand for disgrace. That long echo ensured that even if you physically survived the ordeal, you never truly escaped it socially. There was also the burden of visibility in religious life. Church attendance was not optional in most communities. It structured the week. That meant facing the same neighbors who had witnessed your humiliation or testified against you. Medieval worship was communal and intimate. People stood close, shared ritual space, and participated together in rites. Being present under those conditions, while carrying public stigma, created constant emotional strain. Absence, on the other hand, aroused suspicion. You could not easily withdraw without consequences. The economic ecosystem also lacked abstraction. Today, theft often targets faceless corporations. In the medieval world, theft targeted individuals whose survival was immediately and visibly affected. If you stole a farmer's only plough animal, you saw the farmer's distress directly. The community saw it too. That proximity intensified anger. The moral calculus was not abstract property rights, but tangible harm. Even if driven by desperation, your act was interpreted as an attack on someone equally vulnerable. Legal enforcement could also include financial ruin through fines layered on top of corporal punishment. If sentenced to pay restitution and unable to do so, your remaining possessions could be seized. Household goods, tools, bedding, anything of value might be taken. That stripped your family further. Restitution systems aim to compensate victims, but for poor offenders they often meant cascading poverty. Another grim factor was the absence of standardized incarceration as a long-term sentence. Modern prisons, for all their flaws, can function as spaces where survival is at least physically sustained. Medieval holding facilities were not designed for prolonged habitation. Long-term sentences often translated into forced labor, galley service in later periods, or execution. The concept of years-long imprisonment as a default punishment was less common in earlier medieval contexts, so outcomes were more final and less reformative. Travel to escape reputation was perilous in itself. Roads were vulnerable to bandits, but ironically a known thief could be victimized by other criminals without recourse. If robbed or assaulted, reporting the crime risked exposure of your own status. Outlaws could not rely on law. You lived in a liminal space, subject to punishment but not protected by the system you had violated. Psychological isolation compounded hardship. Maintaining secrecy meant limiting genuine relationships. Confiding in someone risked betrayal. Forming partnerships required trust that was constantly undermined by survival instincts. Suspicion eroded camaraderie. Even within small bands of thieves, loyalty was fragile. Shared risk did not always translate into solidarity. A captured accomplice might name you under pressure. That possibility shadowed every alliance. Food insecurity remained constant, even when theft succeeded. There was no refrigeration, no stable storage for perishable goods without resources. A stolen side of meat could spoil quickly. Grain required grinding and baking. Wine required safe storage, transforming stolen goods into sustained nourishment, demanded infrastructure often beyond a thief's reach. So gains were fleeting, reinforcing the need for repeated risk. Public execution days became social events. Crowds gathered early, vendors sold food, and children watched. The normalization of such spectacles meant that the terror of punishment was woven into ordinary life. For someone contemplating theft, the image of a familiar square, transformed into a stage of death, was unavoidable. Fear was not abstract. It was reenacted regularly before your eyes. Weather could also sabotage escape plans. Heavy cloaks needed for warmth were cumbersome during flight. Muddy roads slowed running. Rivers without bridges required risky crossings. In winter, ice could crack underfoot. In summer, heat exhaustion threatened. Nature did not offer neutrality. It often sided with capture. Guilds and merchant associations sometimes employed private enforcers or relied on collective action to deter theft. Stealing from such groups could result in coordinated retaliation. Unlike isolated individuals, these organizations had resources and influence. A thief caught targeting them might face not just local punishment, but broader exclusion from economic networks. There was also the moral contradiction between necessity and law. Many medieval moral teachings emphasized charity and care for the poor, yet those same societies enforced strict property rights. A hungry person might hear sermons about compassion while facing severe punishment for stealing bread. That tension could breed bitterness or despair, but bitterness offered no protection against enforcement. Even burial grounds reflected hierarchy. Criminals sometimes faced burial in unconsecrated areas or outside traditional cemetery boundaries. For families who believed deeply in sacred geography, this was devastating. It signaled not only social rejection, but spiritual marginalization. The fear of dying dishonored haunted the living thief constantly. Over time, repeated exposure to risk reshaped worldview, fatalism could set in. If capture felt inevitable, risk-taking might increase, leading to bolder acts and harsher consequences. Conversely, constant fear could paralyze action, leaving hunger unresolved. The psychological equilibrium was unstable and draining. Another overlooked factor was the absence of anonymity in craftsmanship. Tools and goods were handmade and recognizable. A carved chest, a woven cloth pattern, a forged blade, all bore marks of origin. Selling such items outside expected channels drew attention. Unlike modern mass-produced goods, medieval objects carried identity. That made fencing stolen property more difficult. In multi-faith or culturally diverse regions, outsiders could be scapegoated quickly. If you belonged to a minority group and were accused of theft, prejudice could amplify severity. Legal protections were uneven. Being socially marginal before the crime increased vulnerability after accusation. And if by rare fortune a thief managed to accumulate enough through crime to improve living conditions, conspicuous change itself aroused suspicion. A sudden improvement in clothing, diet, or housing raised questions. In societies where most people's economic status was stable and visible, unexplained advancement invited scrutiny. Ultimately, it sucked to be a medieval thief because the world was structured to close in on you. From every angle, law threatened your body. Community threatened your reputation. Religion threatened your soul. Poverty threatened your survival. Environment threatened your safety. There was no corner untouched by risk. Every stolen item carried layers of consequence that extended far beyond the moment of taking. To live, that life was to walk permanently on a narrow ridge with cliffs on both sides. Hunger on one side, annihilation on the other. And unlike the romantic tales that survived in legend, most who walked that ridge did not find freedom or glory at the end. They found exposure, punishment, and a memory that lingered long after they were gone. It also meant living in a society where identity was fixed early and rarely escaped. In the medieval world, your occupation, family name, and reputation intertwined tightly. Once you were identified as a thief, that label could override every other part of who you were. You were no longer a son, a father, a labourer, or a neighbour. You were the thief. That flattening of identity made reinvention nearly impossible. There were no new Arfisum phase, no distant cities filled with strangers who didn't know your past. Even if you physically relocated, social networks were so interwoven through trade, pilgrimage, and kinship that stories followed. The architecture of punishment reinforced permanence. Branding, ear, cropping, nose, slitting, or finger amputation were not only painful, they were semiotic. They turned the body into a living document. Every handshake exposed a missing finger. Every uncovered head revealed scars. In a culture deeply attentive to visible signs, such marks were read instantly. They functioned like permanent records carved in flesh. You could not hide them, and you could not appeal them. Another layer of misery was the unpredictability of mercy. Medieval rulers occasionally granted pardons during coronations, marriages, or religious festivals. But such clemency was selective and political. You could not rely on it. Waiting for a royal pardon while imprisoned in poor conditions was a gamble with your health and sanity. And even if pardoned, your reputation might not recover. Legal forgiveness did not guarantee social acceptance. Seasonal migration for work was common in some regions, especially during harvest. For a thief, blending into these labor movements might seem advantageous, but temporary workers were scrutinized closely because they were outsiders. Employers were cautious. Theft during harvest was particularly despised because it targeted the fruits of months of labor. If caught, punishment could be swift and exemplary, intended to reassure resident workers. There was also the danger of false accusation. In times of tension, failed harvests, local disputes, economic stress, someone with a tarnished reputation could be blamed. It also meant living with the knowledge that there was no such thing as a minor mistake. In a medieval setting, a single impulsive decision could not be quietly corrected or legally negotiated down through plea bargains and structured sentencing. There was no standardized appeals system accessible to ordinary people. No forensic re-examinations years later. No media scrutiny to question fairness. Once judgment fell, it tended to fall hard and fast. And because literacy was limited, many accused thieves could not even fully understand the legal language spoken around them. Proceedings might occur in Latin or in a formal dialect unfamiliar to rural defendants. You could stand in a court, hear words determining your fate, and only partially grasp what was happening. Debt itself could blur into criminality. If you borrowed grain and could not repay it, or failed to meet obligations to a lord, the boundary between civil dispute and criminal accusation could thin quickly. In a world without modern bankruptcy systems, inability to pay might be framed as dishonesty. A desperate act to reclaim tools pledged as collateral could be labelled theft. The economic web was tight, and falling through one strand often meant tearing others. Hospitality customs also complicated things. Medieval culture valued hospitality in principle, yet it was bounded by trust and hierarchy. If a stranger abused hospitality by stealing from a host, the moral outrage was intense. It violated not only property, but sacred social norms. That made punishment even more severe, because the act symbolized betrayal of communal ethics. Thieves were seen not merely as lawbreakers, but as breakers of trust, which in a tightly bound society was perhaps the gravest offence of all. Consider also the physical exhaustion. Most medieval labour was manual and grueling. If a thief tried to maintain a legitimate job while secretly stealing to supplement income, he operated under chronic fatigue. Night theft meant lost sleep. Day labour required strength. The body wore down quickly. Malnutrition compounded weakness. A tired thief is a sloppy thief. Sloppiness increases risk, and risk in that era was catastrophic. There were also religious calendars to navigate. Holy days, feast days, and fasting periods structured life. Markets might close. Travel patterns shifted. Theft during a sacred observance could be interpreted as doubly sinful. Being caught stealing during a major feast might provoke outrage amplified by spiritual emotion. Communities gathered more densely on such days, which increased both opportunity and surveillance simultaneously. Weather was not just discomfort, it was hazard. Heavy rain turned streets into mud, slowing escape. Snow left footprints that pointed directly to hideouts. Drought heightened tension around wells and food stores. Every environmental factor altered the calculus of crime. Modern criminals might rely on vehicles and technology to offset such risks. Medieval thieves relied on their own legs and local knowledge. If unfamiliar with terrain, they were vulnerable. A wrong turn could trap them in a dead-end alley or unfamiliar quarter. Even tools were incriminating. Carrying lockpicks, knives, or concealed sacks could arouse suspicion if discovered during routine questioning. There was no presumption that you were innocent until proven guilty in the modern legal sense. Possession of suspicious items might be interpreted as intent. And intent could be punished harshly if authorities wanted to deter would-be offenders. Children growing up around theft absorbed its instability. A household dependent on stolen goods lived in constant anxiety. Parents might teach children to lie convincingly, to hide goods, to flee at signals. That upbringing distorted normal social development. Trust became tactical rather than relational. If a parent was executed or mutilated, trauma was immediate and lifelong. There were no counselors, no structured communal healing processes. Grief merged with stigma. Another brutal aspect was the randomness of enforcement. Some thefts went unnoticed or unpunished. Others triggered overwhelming response. That unpredictability made planning nearly impossible. You could steal several times without consequence and grow overconfident, only to face extreme punishment when finally caught. The gap between perceived risk and actual penalty was vast. It encouraged dangerous illusions of safety. The symbolism of the body mattered deeply in medieval culture. Physical wholeness was associated with honor and divine favor. Mutilation, therefore, did more than reduce ability. It marked someone as morally damaged in the eyes of society. A missing ear or branded cheek was a permanent announcement of disgrace. There was no cosmetic surgery to conceal it, no social movement advocating reintegration. The mark followed you to every market, every church service, every interaction, and church itself was not necessarily refuge. While sanctuary laws sometimes allowed accused individuals temporary refuge in sacred spaces, sanctuary was limited in time and often required confession and eventual departure into exile. It was not immunity. Living within church walls indefinitely was unrealistic. Eventually, one had to face the world outside, often under harsher terms. The psychological contradiction was relentless. A thief might justify actions as survival, yet still internalize shame from sermons condemning greed and dishonesty. Medieval spirituality was immersive. Church bells marked time daily. Religious imagery saturated public life. The tension between need and moral teaching created cognitive strain. Guilt was not abstract. It was reinforced weekly, sometimes daily. Trade expansion in later medieval centuries increased movement of goods. But it also professionalized tracking and accountability. Merchant records, tally sticks, and emerging bureaucratic habits meant discrepancies could be noticed more systematically. As commerce grew more sophisticated, so did efforts to control loss. That meant thieves operated in an environment slowly becoming less forgiving. Execution, when it came, was not always swift. Crowds gathered hours in advance. Condemned individuals might be paraded, giving final statements that could be interrupted or mocked. The emotional weight of awaiting death publicly cannot be overstated. Fear built gradually, surrounded by noise. Even if one escaped execution, the memory of witnessing others endure. It shaped every decision thereafter. Ultimately, the reason it truly sucked to be a medieval thief was not just the danger of punishment, but the total absence of structural mercy. There was no safety net to prevent the first theft, no fair defense to mitigate the second, no rehabilitation to recover from the third. The system was built to preserve order in a fragile world, and preserving order meant sacrificing individuals who disrupted it. Hunger, inequality, war, and disease created pressure. Law released that pressure through spectacle and severity. A medieval thief lived in a narrow corridor between starvation and annihilation. Every stolen loaf, cloak, or coin carried the shadow of mutilation, exile, or death. Community memory locked doors long after prison walls opened. Spiritual fear shadowed physical risk. Aging offered no comfort. Redemption was rare, anonymity fragile, and survival uncertain. In that world, theft was not a glamorous rebellion, but a gamble against a society designed to respond with unforgiving force. It also meant living in a world where silence could condemn you as easily as confession. Medieval legal culture often relied on oaths, sworn statements backed by appeals to divine witness. If you denied theft, you might be required to swear before God that you were innocent. But swearing falsely was believed to endanger your soul. For someone already steeped in religious fear, that was no small burden. Refusing to swear might be interpreted as guilt. Swearing and being disbelieved could still lead to punishment. The framework placed enormous spiritual pressure on the accused, forcing them to weigh earthly survival against eternal anxiety. There was also the instability of coinage and currency. Medieval economies frequently experienced debasement or shifts in acceptable tender. If a thief stole coins, they might discover later that the currency was clipped, foreign, or devalued. Spending unfamiliar coins could arouse suspicion. Markets were places where money was examined carefully. Suspicious currency could trigger questioning about its origin. Even success in theft did not guarantee smooth conversion into usable wealth. Clothing, a common target of theft, presented another problem. Garments were tailored, repaired repeatedly, and recognized in small communities. Distinctive embroidery, patches, or dye patterns were familiar. Wearing stolen clothing locally was dangerous. Selling it required distance. But distance required travel, and travel required explanation. Every solution opened another vulnerability. Punishments could escalate based on repetition. A first offense might bring whipping, a second, mutilation, a third, execution. That progression created a trap. Once punished and marked, legitimate work became scarce. Scarcity pushed individuals back toward theft. The next capture brought harsher consequences. The system did not easily allow someone to break out of that cycle. In effect, early punishment increased the likelihood of future desperation, which then justified even greater severity. There was also the matter of witness testimony. In many medieval courts, testimony from respected community members carried significant weight. But respect was tied to status, property, and reputation. A landholder's word outweighed that of a labourer if accused by someone of higher standing. The odds tilted sharply against you. Even if innocent, challenging a superior's claim was risky. It also meant living in a society where mercy depended less on principles and more on power, mood, and circumstance, where survival could hinge on whether a local lord felt lenient that morning or whether a magistrate wanted to make an example before a restless crowd. Medieval justice was deeply performative. Authority had to be seen to be strong. In fragile economies with limited centralized control, rulers projected dominance through punishment. A thief, especially one without status or allies, became an ideal symbol of disorder to be publicly corrected. The harsher the penalty, the clearer the message. Reputation functioned almost like currency. In tightly woven communities, your name was your credit line, your job application, and your social insurance combined. Once stained by theft, that name lost value instantly. Even rumors could destroy prospects. Suspicion alone might cause neighbors to hide valuables, withdraw cooperation, or refuse shared labor. Medieval agriculture often required collective effort, ploughing strips of open fields, sharing oxen, repairing irrigation. Being excluded from these systems could mean crop failure for your family. So even an unproven accusation could trigger consequences that rivaled formal punishment. There was also the problem of scale. Medieval theft was rarely grand. It was a chicken, a sack of grain, a cloak left unattended, a coin purse cut from a belt. The reward was small and temporary, yet the risk was enormous and long-lasting. This imbalance made the life of a thief structurally irrational, but desperation overrode calculation. A single night's meal could justify the gamble, especially when hunger sharpened every thought. But if caught, that small gain could cost a limb or a life. The disproportion between crime and punishment is what made it so grim to inhabit that role. Markets, which might seem like opportunities for pickpocketing, were also spaces of heightened vigilance. Merchants travelled long distances and guarded their goods fiercely. Some hired guards. Others formed merchant associations for mutual protection. Theft from a merchant was not just stealing from an individual, it threatened trade networks that towns depended on. In some regions, harming trade could bring collective retaliation. Economic self-interest amplified punitive responses. The legal concept of collective responsibility further tightened the net. In certain areas, groups could be fined if they failed to pursue or report criminals among them. This created pressure within communities to police themselves aggressively. If someone was suspected of theft, neighbors had incentive to expose or expel them quickly to avoid shared penalties. That meant a thief often faced not just formal law, but communal self-preservation mechanisms working against him. Technology offered little advantage. There were no sophisticated tools to bypass locks silently. Most medieval locks were simple, but so were doors and walls. Often thin wood or wattle and daub. Breaking in made noise. Dogs were common and effective deterrents. Livestock theft required herding animals that bleated and resisted. Even clothing theft risked immediate recognition because garments were distinctive and often handmade. Wearing stolen attire in the same region could expose the crime instantly. Travelling fairs and pilgrimages might seem like ideal cover due to crowds, but they also concentrated authority. Temporary courts were sometimes set up at large gatherings to handle disputes swiftly. Being caught in such environments could mean expedited judgment. Moreover, strangers at fairs were more noticeable than locals. Language differences and accents betrayed origins. Medieval Europe was multilingual, and crossing linguistic boundaries without explanation invited scrutiny. Another overlooked hardship was illness. Medieval thieves, often living on poor diets and in unstable conditions, were especially vulnerable to disease. Malnutrition weakened immunity. Wounds from failed theft attempts could fester. There were no antibiotics. Even minor infections could become fatal within days. And if sick while hiding or travelling, seeking medical help risked exposure. Physicians and healers were embedded in communities. Outsiders requesting treatment might be questioned. Sickness could trap a thief between suffering in secrecy or revealing themselves to authorities. Climate and environment shaped risk too. In colder regions, winter limited mobility and increased dependency on stored supplies. Stealing firewood or preserved meat during winter was particularly dangerous because scarcity heightened vigilance. In warmer climates, heat and spoilage reduced the value of stolen food quickly. There was little capacity to store goods long term without infrastructure. So the fruits of theft decayed almost as fast as the opportunity arose. The psychological burden of constant concealment reshaped identity. Living under aliases, avoiding eye contact, scanning for patrols, these habits carved tension into daily existence. Chronic stress affects judgment, increasing mistakes. Mistakes lead to capture. The cycle fed itself. Unlike modern criminals who might operate with structured organizations, many medieval thieves acted alone or in loose, fragile groups. Loyalty was thin because survival was paramount. If capture seemed imminent, accomplices might flee or testify against each other. Betrayal was common currency. Social mobility myths did little to soften reality. While some towns offered the principle that a serf who lived within city walls for a year and a day without being reclaimed gained freedom, achieving that milestone required evasion, discretion, and luck. Any accusation of theft during that period could shatter the attempt. Thus, theft undermined one of the rare legal pathways to autonomy. Punishments also varied by gender and age in ways that compounded misery. Men might face mutilation or execution. Women could endure public whipping, head shaving, or forced penance rituals that permanently damaged social standing. For young offenders, corporal punishment was common, embedding trauma early. There was little understanding of rehabilitation for youth. A child labeled a thief might grow into adulthood carrying that stigma-like inherited debt. The moral narrative of the time framed crime as a failure of character rather than circumstance. Poverty was sometimes interpreted as divine testing, but theft was viewed as moral collapse. That framing removed sympathy. Even when communities understood hunger, they feared setting precedents that could unravel order. Mercy toward one thief might encourage another, or so authorities believed. This fear hardened responses. There was also the reality of execution methods themselves. Hanging could be prolonged and agonizing if the drop was short, leading to slow strangulation rather than instant death. Crowds gathered not only to observe but to internalize hierarchy. Children watched. Lessons were learned through spectacle. A thief contemplating risk carried mental images of those scenes, bodies twisting, crowds murmuring. That ever-present imagery weighed heavily. And if by extraordinary luck a thief avoided capture long enough to age, survival did not become easier. Strength faded, reflexes slowed, the body accumulated injuries. Without property or stable trade, aging criminals had few options. Begging was criminalized in many places unless licensed. Poorhouses were rare and often religiously administered with strict conditions. The absence of kin support meant vulnerability to starvation or exposure. Ultimately, it sucked to be a medieval thief because the system offered almost no graceful exit. One could not easily pivot into legitimacy after exposure. One could not rely on anonymity. One could not depend on proportional justice. Every act risked irreversible consequence in a society that valued order above individual mercy. Hunger might push someone into theft. But once inside that identity, escape was narrow and often illusory. The medieval world was not built for second chances. It was built for warning examples, and thieves too often became those examples. Brief sparks of defiance extinguished publicly to illuminate the power of the law. It also meant navigating a world where time itself worked against you, where memory did not fade quickly, and where the absence of written bureaucracy did not equal forgetfulness. In fact, because communities were small and interconnected, oral memory could be even more persistent than written records. A single accusation might follow you for years, carried from village to village by merchants, pilgrims, or travelling clergy. Medieval society ran on storytelling, and once your name entered those stories as the one who stole, that label hardened into identity. There was no easy rebranding, no relocation to a distant metropolis, where millions of strangers diluted your past. Even large medieval cities were intimate by modern standards. You were known, or at least noticed. There was also the economic irony that many thieves stole not from the wealthy elite, but from other poor people, because those were the spaces they had access to. Breaking into a noble's fortified estate was nearly impossible. Guards, walls, and legal retaliation made it suicidal. So theft often targeted open stalls, shared storage, small farms, or fellow labourers. That created cycles of resentment within the same class. Instead of striking upward, many acts of theft redistributed scarcity sideways, intensifying community anger. The thief became not a rebel against injustice, but a perceived traitor to neighbours equally burdened by hardship. In rural areas, open field farming systems made crops visible and accessible, but they also made surveillance collective. Fields were worked communally. Everyone knew roughly how much grain each family harvested. If a sack went missing, suspicion narrowed quickly. It also meant living in a legal culture where punishment was meant to echo long after the act itself, where the body became a billboard of warning, and where justice was less about fairness and more about fear. In many medieval towns, law was local, inconsistent, and deeply personal. A lord's temperament, a magistrate's mood, or a town council's anxiety could shape the outcome of a trial. There was no standardized criminal code applied evenly across all regions. A thief in one jurisdiction might pay a fine, in another he might lose a hand. That unpredictability made every risk exponentially more dangerous, because you were gambling not only against being caught, but against a system that could respond with theatrical cruelty. Public humiliation was weaponized. Being locked in stocks in a marketplace meant enduring hours of ridicule under the open sky, exposed to rain, heat, insects, and the cruelty of neighbours. Rotten vegetables were the mildest missiles. Stones and filth were common. The goal was not simply to punish the body, but to fracture the social identity of the offender. Medieval communities functioned on mutual dependence. To be ostracized was to lose access to work, credit, marriage alliances, and even charity. Almsgiving existed, but it was often conditional upon perceived moral worth. A known thief might be denied even the scraps offered to the deserving poor. Survival after punishment could be harder than before. There was also the economic trap. Medieval economies were fragile, and coinage was limited in circulation, especially in rural regions. If you stole goods rather than money, you had to convert them into usable resources. That meant finding buyers willing to risk association. Informal criminal networks existed, but they were unstable and riddled with betrayal. A fence might report you to authorities for a reward. A fellow thief might cut a deal to save himself. Trust was transactional and thin. And because literacy rates were low, contracts and written agreements offered little protection. Everything depended on reputation, which thieves lacked. Religious doctrine intensified the pressure. Sermons frequently condemned theft as a violation of divine law, reinforcing the idea that criminals endangered not just property, but the spiritual health of the community. Medieval theology emphasized confession and penance, but earthly authorities often interpreted repentance as separate from legal consequence. Even if a thief confessed sincerely, civil punishment could proceed unchanged. In some cases, ecclesiastical courts handled minor offences, but serious theft typically fell under secular jurisdiction. The overlapping systems could create confusion, yet neither offered what we would call rehabilitation. Penance might cleanse the soul. It did not restore lost fingers. The bodily punishments were not symbolic abstractions. They were catastrophic in a manual labour economy. Losing a hand meant losing the ability to farm, build, weave, or fight. Amputation often led to infection and death, because surgical knowledge was primitive and antiseptics non-existent. Even whipping could cause long-term damage. Scar tissue, chronic pain, and reduced mobility could permanently diminish a person's capacity to earn. Thus, punishment frequently ensured economic ruin. A thief who survived the law might still starve later because he could no longer work effectively. Seasonal rhythms added another layer of hardship. Winters were especially unforgiving. Food shortages, freezing temperatures, and limited daylight reduced opportunities and increased risk. Stealing firewood or grain in winter might be more tempting and more dangerous, because communities guarded scarce resources fiercely. During harvest seasons, theft of crops was treated as an existential threat. Grain represented survival through the coming year. Stealing it could provoke swift retaliation from villagers, acting collectively. Medieval justice was not always a formal court. Sometimes it was a crowd with tools in their hands. Urban environments were not safer. Cities like those under the authority of the Republic of Florence or medieval London were dense with opportunity, but also surveillance. Guild members protected their trades aggressively. Stealing tools or materials could result in blacklisting that extended beyond a single town through guild networks. Apprenticeship was one of the few pathways upward for poor youth, but a criminal record, even informal, could close that door permanently. Without apprenticeship, advancement into skilled labour was nearly impossible. Travelling thieves faced linguistic and cultural barriers. Dialects shifted over short distances. Clothing styles signalled origin. Foreign accents could arouse suspicion instantly. Medieval passports did not exist, but letters of introduction did. Lacking them made entry into new towns difficult. Gates often closed at night, and strangers were questioned. Inns required payment and sometimes references. Sleeping rough exposed individuals to weather and to other criminals who might rob them without hesitation. Forest law in some regions treated unauthorized presence in royal forests as a crime in itself, compounding risks for those hiding there. Collective punishment could extend beyond the individual. In some cases, families were fined for the crimes of relatives. A household's reputation might suffer collectively, reducing its standing within the village. Marriage negotiations could collapse. Land leases might not be renewed. In a society where survival depended on cooperation, shared ploughing, communal ovens, mutual aid, being marked as untrustworthy had cascading effects. Children of known thieves inherited stigma, limiting their prospects before they had made any choices of their own. The absence of centralized policing did not mean leniency. It meant that enforcement was communal and sometimes chaotic. Hue and cry systems required citizens to pursue suspected criminals immediately upon alarm. If someone shouted that a thief was running, bystanders were legally obligated in many regions to assist in capture. That created sudden, dangerous chases through narrow streets or across fields. Capture could involve blunt force, injury, or even death before any formal trial. Justice could begin with a beating and end with a rope. Famine years magnified everything. During crises such as those that followed the Black Death, social structures destabilized. Labor shortages altered economic balances, but fear intensified suspicion. Communities traumatized by mass death often searched for scapegoats. While disease was not caused by thieves, marginalized individuals could become convenient targets of anger. In times of panic, due process shrank further. Desperation bred both more theft and harsher responses to it. Even successful long-term evasion was exhausting. Living under assumed identities required constant vigilance. Memory slips about invented backstories could expose someone. There were no databases, but gossip traveled along trade routes, pilgrim roads, and merchant circuits. A known offender in one town might be recognized weeks later in another through rumor alone. Medieval Europe was more interconnected than often assumed. Markets, fairs, and religious pilgrimages created networks of information exchange that undermined anonymity. Psychologically, the moral framework of the era could be crushing. Medieval culture was steeped in ideas of divine judgment, eternal damnation, and cosmic order. A thief might not only fear earthly punishment, but also eternal consequences. That dual anxiety rope in this life, hellfire in the next intensified inner turmoil. Confession offered spiritual hope, yet it also required admitting guilt publicly, potentially sealing one's legal fate. The intersection of faith and law created dilemmas without easy escape. And there was aging. A young thief might rely on speed and agility, but injury, malnutrition, and time eroded those advantages quickly. There were no pensions, no retirement, no safety nets. An older criminal without family support faced bleak prospects. Begging was regulated and sometimes criminalized. Vagrancy laws targeted those without stable employment. Thus, the path from petty theft to destitution could be short and irreversible. What makes the medieval thief's existence especially bleak is the near-total absence of redemption narratives in lived reality. While literature occasionally featured cunning tricksters who outwitted authorities, the average person caught stealing faced consequences designed to eliminate repeat offences by eliminating capacity through death, mutilation, or social annihilation. There was little investment in understanding why theft occurred. Structural poverty, failed harvests, war displacement. These were background conditions, not mitigating factors in courtrooms. So it truly sucked to be a medieval thief. Not because danger added excitement, but because danger was constant, punishment was extreme, mercy was scarce, and survival after exposure was almost impossible. Every theft carried the weight of potential ruin, not only for the individual, but for their family and future. In a world balanced precariously between scarcity and order, stepping outside the law meant stepping into a storm of violence, stigma, and spiritual dread that few could endure for long. It also meant existing in a world where violence was normalized and pain was public policy, where the line between justice and vengeance was thin, and where spectacle reinforced hierarchy every single market day. Medieval authority did not hide punishment behind walls, it displayed it. Gallows were often placed on hills outside towns, so travellers would see the bodies swaying before they even reached the gate. The message was unmistakable: step out of line, and this is your future. For a thief, that image was not abstract. It was a constant, looming possibility. It also meant living inside a moral universe that left almost no room for nuance. Medieval societies tended to categorize people in binaries: faithful or sinful, honorable or dishonorable, trustworthy or corrupt. Once you crossed into the category of thief, you were no longer evaluated act by act. You became a type. And types were dangerous because they justified preemptive suspicion. If something went missing, you were the first questioned. If a rumor spread, it stuck to you more easily than to others. Identity hardened around accusation. The rhythms of medieval justice were not constant but cyclical. After periods of unrest, failed harvests, riots, war scares, authorities often cracked down hard to reassert control. In such moments, punishment intensified. A thief unlucky enough to be caught during one of these waves might face harsher consequences than someone caught months earlier for a similar act. Justice fluctuated with political mood. That unpredictability was terrifying because you could not reliably calculate risk. There was also the stigma of association. If you were known to spend time with other suspected criminals, guilt by proximity followed. Taverns, inns, and public houses were places of gossip and scrutiny. Regulars were observed. Patterns were noticed. Being seen repeatedly with certain people could damage reputation even before any crime was proven. Social life became constrained. You had to choose between isolation and risky company. Medieval property was deeply tied to survival rather than luxury. Tools were handmade and scarce. A single iron ploughshare represented significant investment. Stealing it might cripple a farm for a season. Communities reacted accordingly. Anger was not abstract moral outrage. It was fear of losing capacity to survive winter. So even a small theft could trigger outsized reaction because the margin between stability and disaster was so thin. The sensory experience of punishment itself was brutal. Whipping was not only painful in the moment, it left welts that reopened under strain. Branding seared flesh with iron heated in public view, the smell of burnt skin mixing with crowd noise. These were experiences that lingered in the mind long after wounds healed. Trauma without psychological support calcified into fear or bitterness. Even if you attempted to reform, your past could block entry into guilds or apprenticeships. Guild membership often required proof of good character and sponsorship from existing members. A reputation for theft was disqualifying. Without guild access, skilled trades were closed. You were pushed back toward low-wage labor or illicit activity. Structural exclusion limited alternatives. Marriage was another casualty. In a world where alliances between families were crucial for economic stability, marrying into a household with a criminal record was risky. Prospective in-laws might refuse. Dowries might shrink. social advancement stalled. A single conviction could shrink your matrimonial prospects permanently. Travel for pilgrimage, a common medieval practice, might offer spiritual solace, but not anonymity. Pilgrim badges and routes created networks of recognition. Word travelled along the same roads. Being a known thief could complicate participation in these journeys. Suspicion might follow you even in spaces meant for repentance. There was also the burden of constant improvisation. Without modern tools, communication systems, or transportation, every theft required intimate knowledge of terrain, habits, and timing. Mistakes were costly. A barking dog, a creaking hinge, a neighbour waking early. Small variables could destroy a plan instantly. There was no margin for error. Medieval punishment often included elements designed to shame publicly. Being paraded through town, forced to stand in the pillory while neighbours mocked, having crimes announced aloud. These rituals reinforced collective norms. But they also embedded humiliation deeply. Living afterward meant enduring glances and whispers daily. Even economic improvement in some late medieval regions did not necessarily soften attitudes. As trade expanded and towns grew wealthier, property became even more central to civic pride. Protecting commerce meant protecting reputation as safe and orderly. Thieves threatened that image. Urban authorities might therefore punish more harshly to signal stability to merchants and investors. The absence of centralized record systems sometimes allowed a thief to slip through cracks, but it also allowed arbitrary enforcement. One official might pursue relentlessly, another might ignore similar crimes. There was no consistent oversight. Justice depended on personalities and politics. The psychological effect of repeated marginalization could erode self-worth. Being treated as irredeemable often encourages resignation. If society believed you beyond repair, you might begin to believe it too. That internalization closed off hope of transformation. Without hope, risk tolerance increases. And with it, danger. Old age offered little refuge. Physical decline reduced stealth and endurance. Chronic injuries from past punishments compounded weakness. Without family support or trade skills, aging thieves faced poverty with even fewer options than before. Medieval poor relief was inconsistent and moralized. Known criminals were rarely prioritized. And when death came, whether by disease, injury, or execution, it often came without ceremony or remembrance. Many thieves vanished from record, except as brief entries noting crime and punishment. Their motivations, fears, and contexts dissolved into anonymity. The system preserved their offences, but not their humanity. In the end, what made it truly miserable to be a medieval thief was not just the risk of getting caught. It was the ecosystem of consequences surrounding every act. Law was harsh. Community memory was long. Religion amplified guilt. Economic fragility intensified outrage. Social hierarchy skewed justice. There were almost no institutional mechanisms for rehabilitation or reintegration. The romantic myth of the clever outlaw surviving indefinitely ignores the overwhelming structural reality. Most medieval thieves were not master strategists. They were desperate people navigating a world with razor-thin margins. And that world responded to their desperation with mutilation, exile, spectacle, and erasure. To live as a thief in such a system was to exist under constant threat. not just of punishment, but of permanent exclusion from the fragile web that kept everyone alive. It also meant existing in a world where fear travelled faster than fairness. Medieval rumour was not restrained by evidence standards. If someone whispered that you had been seen near a missing purse or a vanished chicken, that whisper could swell into assumption before you even knew you were suspected. With no formal investigative procedures, suspicion often hardened into accusation through repetition alone. And once accused, clearing your name required social capital you likely did not possess. There was also the ever-present tension between visibility and invisibility. To survive, you needed access to markets, wells, churches, and workplaces, all public spaces. But public spaces meant exposure. The more you withdrew to avoid scrutiny, the more suspicious you appeared. The more you engaged to appear normal, the greater the chance someone recognized you or connected you to past rumors. It was a trap without a clean solution. Medieval justice was deeply intertwined with hierarchy. If you stole from someone powerful, a landholder, a guild master, a cleric, the response could be swift and uncompromising. Influence mattered. A well-connected victim could push for harsher sentencing. Meanwhile, if you stole from someone equally poor, communal anger might be even more intense, because the harm was immediate and personal. In both directions, you faced hostility. The economic consequences of conviction extended beyond fines. Tools could be confiscated. Livestock seized, land rights revoked. In agrarian systems, losing access to land was catastrophic. Land was not just property, it was livelihood. Without it, you were forced into labour markets already saturated with the poor. That vulnerability increased the temptation to steal again, perpetuating the cycle. Punishment rituals were carefully staged to maximize humiliation. Pillories and stocks were placed in central high-traffic areas. Offenders were displayed at times when crowds were largest, market days, festivals, after church. The intention was clear: turn individual suffering into communal warning. But for the person in the stocks, hours under the sun or rain while enduring insults, thrown refuse and physical pain carved humiliation deep into memory. There was also the psychological erosion of constant anticipation. Even when you had not stolen recently, you lived with the possibility of being recognized or confronted. That chronic vigilance shaped posture, speech, and behavior. Anxiety became baseline. Sleep was uneasy. Dreams might replay scenes of pursuit or punishment. Without any concept of trauma therapy, those internal wounds festered. Seasonal hunger intensified pressure. Late winter and early spring were notorious for scarcity before new crops emerged. This hungry gap tempted theft precisely when communities were most protective of dwindling stores. Getting caught during such a season could provoke harsher reaction, because fear of starvation was acute. Social rituals like weddings, funerals, and feast days might appear as opportunities. Crowds distracted, goods unattended. But they also heightened emotional stakes. Theft during a wedding or funeral was seen as particularly dishonorable. The moral violation compounded the legal one. Punishment could reflect that added outrage. If imprisoned, survival depended heavily on outside support. Jails did not reliably provide food.